Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Algernon Blackwood, and Clark Ashton Smith are all names that you've likely heard if you enjoy horror literature. But despite each of these writers achieving massive success with different genres of literature, there's one thing that connects each of them. At some point in their careers, they all added to an obscure horror subgenre named weird fiction. So, what is weird fiction? What makes a story weird? These are questions that I hope will be answered in this video. Because of the nature of the weird tale, it's incredibly difficult to define it as a genre, making this a very hard video to research for. I've spent probably over 200 hours researching for this video, even digging out my own collection of Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Machen, and Algernon Blackwood stories and making footnotes from my findings. Some points I make in this video are anecdotal to my own reading experience, and others from those with more authority on the subject. So if there's anything you think I've missed, let me know in the comments. Weird fiction is a form of speculative fiction originating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and either eschews or reinterprets traditional horror antagonists such as ghosts, vampires, and witches. At its core, it's a term used to loosely describe horror, fantasy, and supernatural tales which eschew genre tropes. Despite the term weird fiction not coming about until the 20th century, Edgar Allan Poe is often regarded as the genre's pioneer. The father of cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft, identified Poe as the first author of a particular style of supernatural fiction which differed from Gothic fiction's themes and philosophies somewhat. Later, commentators within the literary sphere would suggest Poe was the first weird fiction writer. Similarly, Sheridan Le Fanu, who would later go on to write the Gothic masterpiece Camilla, is also thought of as one of weird fiction's early writers. As with many literary genres, weird fiction flourished in the Victorian era, and the timelines of both weird fiction and what I like to call the ghost story revolution overlap one another. So much so that you may have noticed that authors categorized as writers of ghost stories are also categorized as writers of weird fiction, some of the most notable being Algernon Blackwood, Robert E. Howard, and M.R. James. To understand the themes behind the genre, I think it's important to first take a quick look at the works of the man often cited as its pioneer. Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, poet, editor, and literary critic from Boston, Massachusetts, and as well as being known as the pioneer of the weird tale, he is regarded as one of the centermost figures of an artistic, musical, literary, and intellectual movement called Romanticism. In a nutshell, Romanticism was categorized by its emphasis on emotion, individualism, clandestine nature, idealization of nature, suspicion of science, and industrialism, and a strong preference of the medieval over the classical. This movement, much like that of the modern ghost story, also overlapped the emergence of the weird tale. Poe was one of the earliest practitioners of the short story over in America, as well as being considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre and a significant contributor to the emerging genre of science fiction. In 1827, he published his first poetry collection, Tamerlane and Other Poems. At around the same time, he enlisted in the United States Army. In the coming years, after being discharged from the army, Poe turned his attention to prose rather than poetry. He placed his stories with the Philadelphia publication house and began work on his first and only play, Polition. In 1839, Poe published a short story collection called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, and this is where the weird started to show in his work. Contained therein were the stories The Fall of the House of Usher, MS Found in a Bottle, the MS standing simply for manuscript, and The Devil in the Belfry. These stories, I would argue, are important in that while not being out-and-out weird fiction stories, they contain certain themes which would later cross-pollinate with the genre while sprinkling little tidbits of obscure American and European folklore throughout, which is a pretty common element of weird fiction. Poe's work from this point onward would often intertwine the themes of his stories with those of Gothic fiction, science fiction, and folklore. This resulted in a pretty unique and distinct blend of fiction which other authors would soon expand upon, such as Arthur Machen, Robert W. Chambers, Lord Dunsany, and Algernon Blackwood. Ambrose Bierce, decades later, was also afforded the same courtesy as being hailed as one of the genre's pioneers, and much like Poe, his works were incredibly influential influential to the genre, often leaning more heavily into the fantasy and magical aspects of this newfound genre. Later in its lifespan, in the 20th century, is where it began to expand even further. This is due in part to a highly influential group of writers who have since been dubbed the Lovecraft Circle. Until this point, none of the authors mentioned had actually described themselves as writers of weird fiction, because the term hadn't yet existed, but Lovecraft, in his many essays and letters, described himself as just that, and actively sought out like-minded individuals who categorized themselves as such. What resulted was a group of writers consisting of authors such as Frank Belknap Long, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, and August Derleth, to name just a few. This group would trade ideas and knowledge between themselves, writing quite a large quantity of stories which were published in the pulp magazine named Weird Tales, while also occasionally writing works adjacent to Lovecraft's own mythos. With a more unified and controlled approach to the weird, there was less of a focus on folklore and an even greater focus on the scientific aspects of the genre, at least from what I can gather. And just as weird fiction had overlapped with the popularization of the ghost story, it also overlapped with Lovecraft's own genre, which would later be known as cosmic horror. It's generally considered that this era of weird fiction ended with the advent of World War II, but in the early 2000s, author M. John Harrison coined the term New Weird to describe the works of a new group of writers who were blending elements of science fiction, horror, and fantasy into their world building. This contemporary revival of the weird has been added to by authors such as Jeff Vandermeer, Alistair Reynolds, Laird Barron, and Michael Sisko. In 2020, the Weird Tales magazine saw a relaunch, and as of the writing of this video, issue number 366 is available for pre-order. So, sometime in the near future, we could actually be looking at a revival of the genre in a big way. Weird fiction, by its very nature, is a difficult genre to define. If you were to define any other genre, say Gothic fiction for example, it would be relatively easy to do so because there are certain themes, philosophies and tropes that can be identified. That's not really the case with weird fiction. It's an abstract, surreal voice in the realm of fiction. This is due in part to the genre's themes being a blend of elements from other genres such as Gothic fiction, science fiction and even folktales, while also completely eschewing others. But it's unique enough that if you were to read a weird tale, you'd know what it is. It's a nebulous expression of theme and tone, utilising unusual themes from multiple genres and doing away with genre tropes. Lovecraft explains it better than I ever could, so I'll let him do just that. In one of his essays entitled Supernatural Horror in Literature, he provides his own definition of the weird tale. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer, unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness, becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain. A malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Later, in 1983, in yet another essay titled Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, Lovecraft defines 4 types of weird tale. There are, I think, 4 distinct types of weird story, one expressing a mood or feeling, another expressing a pictorial conception, a third expressing a general situation, condition, legend, or intellectual conception, and a fourth explaining a definite tableau or specific dramatic situation or climax. In another way, weird tales may be grouped into 2 rough categories, those in which the marvel or horror concerns some condition or phenomenon, and those in which it concerns some actions of persons in connection with the bizarre condition or phenomenon. Jeff Vandermeer has also written about his own exploration into the weird, and states, "Usually, the characters in weird fiction have either entered into a space unfamiliar to most of us, or have received such hints of the unusual that they have become obsessed with the weird. Whether it exists or not, they have fallen into dialogue with it. They may pull back from the abyss, they may decide to unsee what they saw, but still, they saw it." Both of these writers I would consider authorities on the subject, and from these quotes we can learn a lot about the genre. As per Lovecraft's quote, we can gather that one of the core themes must be the unknown, which cross-pollinates with and was adopted by his own genre of fiction, cosmic horror. This is also a theme adopted with those who were writing ghost stories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries too, and harkens back to my video, Elements of the Modern Ghost Story, in which I explore the importance of reticence within a ghost story. Vandermeer's quote also points towards this. The core of weird fiction is a blend of genres and elements, using a slew of sources from across the internet and also what I can glean from my own exploration. These genres I think can be narrowed down to 6: Gothic fiction, science fiction, folktales, romanticism, ghost stories, and fantasy. Themes taken from these genres can include, but are not limited to, the following: suspicion of science, which comes from romanticism and gothic fiction to some extent, extraterrestrial creatures, parallel universes, the perversion of political and sometimes religious ideas, tentacles, and occulted knowledge, specifically within the scientific sphere, which come from science fiction, fabled beings such as magical creatures, but sometimes with a scientific or cosmic twist, from folktales, magic realism, man versus nature, and or man versus himself, and lost civilizations from fantasy, mortality, inner dilemma, and the supernatural from ghost stories and gothic fiction. These themes are interchangeable. Some of those listed may be included or eschewed from a particular story depending on what the story and the writer are trying to convey. Some may lean much more heavily into the gothic, and others more into science fiction and fantasy, for example. But in each, there is one element that remains: the supernatural. At its core, weird fiction is supernatural fiction with the added twists of scientific and gothic themes. It's its own particular brand of supernatural fiction, sure, but supernatural fiction nonetheless. And because weird fiction is a loose term, some stories can be wildly different from one another. But ultimately, the supernatural element, whether reinterpreted or repurposed, is a constant element and the foundation of the genre. The forms which the supernatural can take can be radically different per story. Some stories utilise a more traditional sense of the supernatural, such as vampires or ghosts, but reinterpreted in ways that remove them from their gothic counterparts. Or it could be a little more out there, so to speak, perhaps interdimensional beings or fantastical godlike emissaries. Either way, the supernatural is there. For example, let's compare Arthur Machen's brand of the supernatural to that of Robert W. Chambers. Machen's work often contained a certain contempt for science, and also a contempt for progress, largely because he was a devout Christian. In his work, science is treated with disdain and suspicion, but magic is a divine and elegant, yet equally terrifying force. The Great Godpan and the White People, for example, opt for a more folkish and traditional angle when handling the supernatural, which creates this sense of divinity and beauty, yet it's interpreted in such a way that it becomes almost uncanny or unknowable. It's taking something we're familiar with, folk legends, spirits, and escaping the boundaries and laws of how these things operate, which creates an inescapable air of dread. Now, if we look at the work of Chambers, it's of course still deeply seated in the supernatural, but of a different variety. The King in Yellow is a play, which is possibly cursed or maybe even a cosmic force, though this is never confirmed. It's different from Machen's work in that the forces displayed here are less traditional, not necessarily more unique, but certainly more unknowable. They could be of the magical variety, or of the cosmic, or even ghostly, but it's so far removed from tradition that it's entirely new. There is also a recurring theme of madness here too. Both of these writers are masters of the weird tale, and yet they're different enough that they could almost be mistaken for entirely different genres, but that's the beauty of it. You never truly know what you're in for when you begin reading the weird. For those of you who are interested in the genre but don't know where to start, here's what I think are some great stories to start with. The House on the Borderland by Ambrose Bierce, The Great Godpan and the White People by Arthur Machen, Teatro Grotesco by Thomas Ligotti, and The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The stories and collections I just mentioned aren't necessarily the most influential stories in the genre, just my personal favourites, so if there's one you think I should have mentioned, let me know in the comments below. If you've watched this far, I appreciate you taking the the time to listen to me talk about a rather obscure subgenre of horror for as long as I have. If you learned something or just enjoyed the video, please consider supporting the channel by leaving a like and a comment, and if you want to see more of this style of content, please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. I originally created this channel as a way to create discussion about interesting horror topics, and that's still pretty much the channel's primary goal. So, with that said, if anyone has anything they'd like to add, or if there are any scholars of weird fiction out there watching, please feel free to chime in. Thank you for watching.